To get ahead of 99% of people in the next year, you're going to need to master one skill, entering a flow state. And you do this by learning how to manipulate your energy. Once you're able to do this consistently, you'll be able to overcome any emotional resistance so that you actually finish the work required to make an impact. And I have found that this not only results in more productivity, but it's also helped me to be able to get into alignment with my life's purpose, as well as to ultimately find more satisfaction in the work that I do every single day. And that's what I want to help you to do over the course of this video. So I'm going to start with some basic principles and then draw on some laws of nature to help lay the groundwork to illustrate all of my points, and then combine all of this so that way I can show you some easy steps on how you can apply this to your everyday life so you can become the best in your field. So let's start at the beginning.
It began with the forging of the great rings.
Sorry, not that beginning. I meant the beginning of getting things done. Getting anything done requires energy, specifically activation energy. This energy comes in a variety of forms. Sometimes it's physical strength, other times it's in our emotional endurance or capacity. And then there are other times where it's just the sheer number of calories available for our bodies to burn. It's measured a lot of different ways. And that's because it's one of the fundamental building blocks of both the universe and our bodies. And I think we can all agree that it takes effort on our part to do just about anything. And if we want to get stuff done, we're going to need energy to accomplish the work. The trouble is for a lot of us is that we have a hard time managing that energy, both in terms of having enough, but also in knowing where to direct our effort once we have that energy required. Because I'll be honest, there have been entire days when I needed to be doing something productive like homework or preparing a YouTube video or following up on a sales client. But instead, I ended up distracting myself with either a chore or some task that seemed productive, but it wasn't actually moving the needle. And so those are our two tasks: gathering and sourcing energy, and then directing and managing that energy. For all of us, emotional energy has to come from a source. And there are two ways that it comes to us, either from an external source or an internal source. External emotional energy I refer to as inspiration, and internal emotional energy I refer to as motivation. Let's talk about inspiration real quick. Again, this is an external emotional energy source. I think when most of us think of motivation, we think of your classic speakers like Tony Robbins or Gary Vaynerchuk, any other thought leadership person who's providing us with some kind of emotional boost. It can come in the form of an emotional story or a new perspective on a problem or a challenge that we're facing, or possibly like a reward or a punishment that some external source is providing for us, like our boss. All of these are external, and they're imposed on us at times, and sometimes we elect or we volunteer to basically have them in our lives. The other kind of energy that I like to talk about is internally based. It's our internal emotional source, motivation. And as human beings, we are driven internally, whether we like it or not, by our emotions. Our emotions make up our fuel source. And my working theory is that every internal emotional motivation can be boiled down to 4 core emotions that we all experience. They are anger, fear, desire, and love. Now, a little side quest real quick. I actually grew up in South Florida, and one of the things that I did a fair amount of was camping with my family as well as with youth groups. And I think most people would agree that camping often involves making fire. And so I actually had to get pretty good at this, especially with Florida being a bit of a swampland, and going into the backwoods meant basically starting fire from a bunch of different fuel sources and a bunch of different wet conditions. Now, a lot of this happened in my teens, and like a lot of 14-year-olds, I really grew to love making fire. I developed a bit of a fascination with it. And I learned from experience that depending on what fuel you used, it really was possible to singe your eyebrows right off. I learned all the differences between propane, gasoline, how long a palm frond, a branch, or your typical log would burn for, which trees were the best ones to get them from. And I found it super helpful to relate these 4 emotions that I was talking about earlier to some of the types of fuel, basic fuels that we would use when making a camping fire. So generally speaking, those 4 fuels that we would use the most of would either be logs, branches, twigs, or some kind of gas. Now, in my mind, I actually correlate the types of fuel that we would use for camping for the same types of fuel that we use emotionally as we try to build up this motivational fuel source. And for me, the logs represent love. The medium-sized branches represent desire. Twigs and palm fronds, that kindling material, represents fear. And then all of the different forms of gas that we would use represent anger. Now, each of these fuel sources can be incredibly helpful if they're used at the right time, in a good setting, as well as the right safety precautions. But they can all each be dangerous as well. It just depends on the different circumstances that are surrounding us. And since our goal is to be able to be in a flow state, we need to be able to manage these emotions consistently, just like you would manage a fire. And we want to be able to do this over an extended period of time. That way we have enough energy to last us for the duration of time that's needed for us to actually accomplish our goal. So if our goal is to push through an intense 5-minute sprinting workout, and that's it, then we can get by with something that can power us through those fast 5 minutes. But if our goal is to have a productive career or a long-lasting marriage, then we'll need a fuel that's much more likely to sustain us for the long run. And that's hopefully a very, very long time. Otherwise, we burn out. And depending on the goal or the objective, we can create a blend of different fuels. So for example, during a workout, I remember being told as a kid by some of my coaches and my teammates that I needed to be able to push through the pain. And they found it helpful for me to be able to say, hey, you need to go to a dark place and just power through. And translating that for my coaches, they were basically telling me to dig deep, find some kind of anger or fear, and then just use that emotion to push me through a moment of suffering to get to a better state of strength or victory. Now, here's the thing, that actually works. As to whether or not it's sustainable depends on how much anger or fear you have, as well as how much you're willing to replenish that source of anger or fear. Because believe me, if you go looking for that, you will find it. There's always more fuel to be had in each of these sources if you go looking for it. But there's also a danger in constantly running on certain emotions. Because like most fires, sometimes when we start on a project or a venture, we start with something more combustible, like a fuel source that burns hot and fast. And then we transition over time to something more sustainable, like desire, or better yet, love. And I think each of these emotions have a place. I don't know that there's one that's truly better over all the others across all circumstances. I do think, though, that there are certain emotions that are better under certain circumstances. Like, I don't think it's a very good idea to get married out of fear that we won't find somebody else. That's just not likely to last, in my opinion. But if a relationship or a career is fueled mostly by love, then it has a much better chance of lasting so long as the right conditions are maintained. And that does bring me to the point that you sometimes need to protect that fire. You need to be prepared for conditions surrounding the fire to change, because this world is a state of constant change. It's a law of nature. Sometimes it is storming on your fire, and you need something to block that water and wind. So you better be prepared to build that protection if the fire is important to you. So again, real quick recap. Gas represents anger. It burns super hot and it's fast. It's likely to run out quickly, but it can also overpower most external conditions. This is really great for a starting point, especially if you're struggling to get going. But there is a strong burnout effect, and that is isolation and the alienation that you experience as you depend on it too much.
I can feel your anger.
Just ask Anakin. Then there's the twigs, right? This is the fear. This is another great starting emotion that can get you moving. A little bit less dangerous compared to anger, but at the same time, it does still require good conditions. It has the potential to burn out very quickly though, and the resulting paralysis that comes from that is often that freeze or that anxiety that we experience as we over worry. Next up are the branches, and I correlate these two desires. This has the benefit of being both more sustainable as well as possible to start a fire with this material. But being able to do both requires preparation as well as ideal conditions. But it is much easier to maintain compared to something like anger or fear, so long as you know what you're after. And it's also important to point out that depending on the desires and the volume of them, it can smother the fire. So you just want to manage that, and you want to make sure that those desires are balanced out. And then the final part of this little analogy is, of course, the logs, which represents love. This is obviously going to be really hard to start with, but it can be done. That would require a lot of extra preparation, but it's also definitely the most long-lasting and sustainable. All you really have to do once it's going is just keep your stock up and protect the fire. So the key to being able to produce these emotions is just understanding the source. And at the same time, that fuel is going to vary, and it's also going to need to be matched on the circumstance or the goal. And I'm thinking about making a video about this in more detail. So if that sounds interesting, please just let me know in the comments. But what I'll simply say for now is that the simplest way to source these motivational emotions for yourself is to either think of core memories or people that are related to those emotions. But for now, it's just important to realize that the fuel for our flow state comes from these 4 core emotions, and we need to be aware of them as well as how they burn. Okay, so now that we've talked about sourcing these emotions, let's talk about directing and managing them into a flow state. Now, in order to master your own energy, you have to not only understand where it comes from and how to source it, but also how to direct and manage it. And that's most easily done by understanding some fundamental laws of nature on how energy is managed. And the first basic idea that you want to get a handle on is something called entropy. It's a bit of a fancy word created by scientists, and there are a lot of comprehensive explanations about this, but simply put, all entropy states is that energy, if left alone without any interference, is going to spread itself out until it's evenly distributed. Right? Very simple, very straightforward. A very simple example of this that we all experience every day is with heat. Heat is a form of energy, and that energy spreads. You can see this super easily if you light a match. That match is going to create a chemical reaction which burns on the little stick until the match runs out of wood to burn. And if we hold our hands close to the match, we would actually be able to feel the heat coming from it.
Sometimes I let matches burn down to my fingertips just to feel something, anything.
But if we're far away, we won't feel a thing, because that heat and that energy is spreading itself out thinner and thinner the farther we get from the source.
I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
Forgive me, I had to make those references. Now, this is where things get cool in my opinion. There are things that we can do to focus that energy so that way it has a greater impact. And there are also things that we can do to protect that energy so that way the natural process of it spreading out is slowed down. Keeping it simple here, the laws that govern entropy and the flow of energy also govern every other resource known to man. Now, the good news is there are specifically 2 things that we can do that will slow down entropy so that way we're able to maintain control of our energy and our resources. And they can be simplified into insulation and focus. All right, I'm going to dive deep on each of them here in a second as well to give you some practical applications. But it's just important to point out that by using the tools of insulation and focus, it's going to allow us to make the most of the energy that we have without having to go find more fuel. And this is what most people mean by entering a flow state. What most people are trying to say is that when they are in a flow state, everything is so efficient and so aligned that the work seems effortless, even if it is in fact hard work. It's just that there's less friction or less of a grind as we're feeling and trying to accomplish something. Our emotional energy and our physical resources go farther. So let's dive deep on insulation and focus. First, insulation. Insulation at its core is about creating and protecting space, so that way it cannot be interfered with. We see practical examples of this every day. It's in the cars that we drive that have sound dampening in them, so that way there's less road noise coming through. It's also in our homes that have a fiberglass insulation, so that way the heat and the cold weather from outside don't impact the home temperature nearly as much. Or it's even something as simple as putting in earplugs to block out the noise of a loud environment. And there are several ways to apply this insulation to our emotional energy, but I'm just going to mention a few. First up is something called monk mode. If you've been on the internet at any point recently, you've probably heard of monk mode. It's been going around for the last couple of years. But just to recap, monk mode is where you go into a state of deep focus and remove all distractions to make a significant change of your life over an extended period of time. And it's important to point out that the most effective use of monk mode is seasonal. It's a period of deliberate concentration on one domain of your life, and then maintenance in the other 3 or 4 domains that matter the most to you, and then ignoring everyone and everything else. That's it. Before it was called monk mode, I didn't really realize that's what it was, but I ended up doing a lot of it in my early sales career in door-to-door sales. I would actually end up going out with a team for a summer and then spend a little over 100 days on the doors where I would basically get up, eat and get ready, practice and rehearse my pitch alone, then go to a team meeting and train some more with my team. And then we would leave immediately to go knock doors and sell for 4 to 5 hours, have a quick hour break of lunch as a team again, then knock doors for another 5 to 6 hours. And then we would drive home, eat, go to sleep, and wake up the next day to do it all over again. That was all we did. I generally avoided dating unless I was already in a relationship. I would go for a 5K run once every few days and then just hang out with my teammates on Saturday nights and go to church on Sunday. But there were no other options. I was just maintaining the other parts of my life. And that's because I was focused on growing my bank account through sales. And then the few things that actually mattered in the long run, like my health, my relationships, my faith, those were all in maintenance mode. We would knock 200 doors a day, and that was it. That was my focus. Just talk to 50 decision makers, and then the rest just was ignored. And that level of insulation is a powerful thing. There are no distractions when you do it right. And I even went so far as to tell my family and my friends in advance that I would be completely unavailable during those summer months. And this is what it's like when you truly experience and dive deeply into monk mode. You tolerate no excuses or distractions. The key to it, though, is that this is a seasonal thing. Once I was done and I accomplished my goal, first of all, it felt amazing, but then I would actually reassess, relax, and decide on what the next area of my life that I wanted to focus on. Now, a second and closely related to the skill of monk mode is the skill of time blocking. Time blocking is very similar, except instead of periods of months of focus at a time, you're thinking about hours of a day to accomplish a task or work on a project. Gary Keller, the real estate investing mogul and founder of Keller Williams Real Estate, is the person that I learned this from. And he refers to this process throughout his best-selling book, The One Thing. This is basically monk mode in a step-by-step, hour-by-hour format, because this is where you're going to block out significant periods of time in a day to accomplish one specific task. And you insulate yourself from the rest of the world until the job is done. You're going to leverage things like airplane mode or turning off your phone to avoid any and all potential distractions. You remove yourself from any environment where you could be interrupted or where you're likely to be interfered with. And then you set aside time in advance to do this and make sure that no one or nothing can reach you. And you do everything possible to make sure that you are present for that time that you blocked aside so that way you can get the job done. You come prepared to that 2-hour time block or however long you choose with an empty bladder. You have snacks to fuel you if it's going to take several hours. And then if a true emergency actually does erupt before you're actually able to take care of the task, right? Before you actually go take care of the emergency, you then block out a different time period where you will return to get that job done. This is exactly what I used to do when I was lead generating in my door-to-door sales days. And I even now still use this in my personal coaching and education business. And it's been incredibly powerful for me because there are tasks like lead generation, sitting down to write and just develop my content. These things are pretty tough for me, especially to get started on. But once I'm actually up and going, Basically, everything takes care of itself so long as I'm not letting any distractions into the process. And that's what the point of this time blocking skill is. And the third tool here is a lifestyle tool that's been incredibly beneficial for not only managing my energy, but also my happiness and my peace. It's a management of your information diet, because you need to face it, in a capitalist-driven society like here in the United States, most companies and causes are doing everything they can to capture not just your dollar, but also your attention, because they know if they can have your attention, they can find a way to turn that into a dollar, either by selling to us directly or indirectly. And so to capture our attention, we are constantly assaulted with a bombardment of opinions, emotional triggers, and artificial urgency to intrigue and hold our attention. And I acknowledge the fact that as a self-proclaimed content creator and marketer, I'm also contributing to the noise. The key point, though, that I would like to make even more is that we have a strong degree of control to both what we access and what is recommended to us in our social and news feeds. And we should do everything we can to manage it, both in terms of volume and quality. And so if you choose to consume content on a platform that's controlled by an algorithm, which is most outlets these days, then keep in mind that the more you watch, the more you suggest to the algorithm that this is the kind of content you want. And this becomes a reinforcing habit and loop for the system that can be really incredibly helpful if you train the algorithms the right way, but also pretty dangerous if you don't. So let me just ask you, how much are you consuming on social media? How much TV do you consume? Who's in control of that content? And does that quality of content inspire you? Or does it make you angry and pissed off at some kind of labeled group? Because if you're constantly checking these feeds and outlets that are made up of manufactured stress and cortisol, you are choosing to be influenced, if not completely driven by the emotions that are being fed to you. And speaking from both my education as a bachelor's in communications and media, as well as my own personal observations, I promise you that over 70% of that diet is driven by the emotions of fear and anger. And if you need any more proof, just go watch the news tonight. Right now, it's the height of election season, and while the mudslinging never really stops in politics, it's particularly dirty right now. Now, shifting gears here, let's talk for a few minutes about the power of focusing your emotional energy. As I mentioned in one of my past videos, there's most often here a few tasks or systems or objectives that we need to complete in order to move the needle in a disproportionately large way. So often what makes the biggest impact are often the smallest activities. And focusing is about doing just that, creating massive impact on our results by directing all of our available energy at accomplishing the one thing that will make everything else easier or unnecessary. So to direct our energy, we first have to know what we're aiming at. And that's where the first tool for focusing comes into play. And this is called a vivid vision. I first learned about this concept of a vivid vision from Cameron Herold. And I'll actually include a link to the book here in the description. But basically in his book, Vivid Vision, which is just basically focused on creating a vision for a business, but you can take it and apply it equally to your life. The idea basically boils down to that once you know exactly what you're looking for in your life, by being able to map it out and have a clear picture of exactly what you want your life to look like in the next 3 years, you make everything getting there easier. And how Cameron describes this process of developing a vivid vision is similar to the idea of designing a home. You might have a contractor or an engineer to help you to do the bulk of the architectural work, or just make sure that the laws of physics and engineering are being broken. But at the end of the day, you are the voice of the designer, and the design of the home and the design of your life should be yours, not someone else's. It should have your personality, your hobbies built into the vision. It should be what you are looking for and what you need out of your life, rather than what the crowd wants or what you think other people might enjoy about you or your life or your metaphorical house. And let me know in the comments if you want me to make more detailed instructions around the vivid vision. But what I can say is that your vivid vision should include each of the key elements of life in order for you to be a complete human being. It should address areas like your health, your relationship, your faith or philosophy for living a good life. It should also include how you spend your time in your career, your hobbies, as well as your closest relationships. Now, I will be the first to admit that as a young man in my teens and 20s, I didn't know exactly what I wanted for my life. And there's a chance that might apply to you too. And that's perfectly okay, right? Because there is a substitute for knowing what you want, and that's knowing what you do not want. Most people at just about any age have had some kind of powerful experience where they've realized or seen something that said, hey, I don't want this, or I don't want what he has. And I'd be willing to bet that you've had multiple experiences if you just sit and reflect on the things that you don't want. And those can be very powerful to get you moving in the right direction. And what you'll find is that, especially in your early 20s and 30s, this vivid vision should be something of a living document. It's going to need to be adapted as you encounter new circumstances, new experiences, and test new ideas and theories. One of my favorite quotes about the process of just discovering who you are and trying to figure out what you want to become comes from the psychologist and therapist Carl Jung. And he said, life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you're just doing research. And I can ratify that. I'm still learning a ton about myself in this process. So give yourself some grace, because while it sounds cool to be on the Forbes 40 under 40 list, it's not really the meaning of life. So don't feel like you need to be in a rush to build the next Apple or to be the next Mr. Beast. Take your time. Figure out, experiment, have fun, write your vivid vision along the way, and just keep it as a living document and update it as it goes. And then as you get older, you can turn it into a more concrete system. But the whole point is that the vivid vision should operate like a magnet, where it propels you away from the things and experiences and the people that you want minimal exposure to, and at the same time attract the ones that you want in your life. It fundamentally requires that you be yourself and that you learn who you are through this process. Otherwise, you end up repelling and attracting the wrong life. Now, as you craft and take aim on what you want your life to look like, you'll need to understand where this emotional energy is coming from and how to apply and maintain it. And frankly, one of the best tools for this comes from Simon Sinek's TED Talk in his book called Start With Why. And it's the tool that he calls your golden circle. To briefly sum it up, the golden circle is based on the emotional and logical structures of our brains. And so if you think about a circle with 3 layers to it, you would have an inner core layer of the circle, which would be represented by the question why. And then there would be a middle layer, which is represented by the question how, and the outer layer, which is represented by the question of what. And the reason for this structure is because the motivations of why we do things, how we go about them, and what it is that we actually do is determined by the wiring and makeup of our brains. At a fundamental level, our brains have those same 3 layers. 2 of them are emotional and 1 is logical. And the layers that are the oldest and that evolved first are the 2 emotional layers. They make up the limbic system of our brains. And where the newest and most capable section of our brain that controls things like rational thought and speech is something called the neocortex. And while that logical neocortex layer is more capable and has much more potential, it has way less leverage or strength over the other 2 parts of the limbic system. And that's because the 2 layers of the limbic system evolved first. They are also grown first as we are growing babies. They are the foundation of our processing systems that we grow up with. And it's for that reason that we react emotionally or with our nervous system's fight or flight system every time we feel threatened. But the good news is that we can harness this system to help understand our motivations and do the things that matter most to us. Because once we understand what our core why is and the methods we go about executing it, then what we actually do comes quite naturally to us. And if you'd like a workbook on this process, I would really recommend Simon Sinek's workbook, Find Your Why. It's got everything you could possibly need to dive deep into that introspective work and understand what it is that drives you. And the final tip for today on how to really focus your emotional energy would be to have an accountability partner. Somebody to share your goals with, but also to do follow-up with on a regular basis. And this has been very well documented. There's a couple of key studies that show how to do this well. The first one was done by the American Society of Training and Development, and it was done back in 1995. In this study, the initial groundbreaking element of this was that it revealed that the likelihood of accomplishing a goal rises by 65% when a person commits to somebody else. But then having a specific accountability appointment where you actually go back and talk through what you did, that increases the chance of success by 95%. And then in 2007, Dr. Gail Matthews took this idea even farther. She actually took it and broke it down into 5 different levels of accountability. The first one, the group 1, was thought only. You just thought about the goal. Group number 2 was written goals. Group number 3 was written goals and action-based commitments. Group number 4 had written goals, action commitments, and a friend's involvement. And then group number 5 had all of it put together, as well as weekly progress reports. And the results that came out of this study were this. That first group that had thought only had a success rate of 43% in hitting their goals. Group number 2 that had written goals, they had a success rate of 61% by achieving their goals. The group number 3 got a little weird. With written goals and action commitments, their success rate was 51%, so a little bit lower. Kind of strange. That fascinated me for a little while. But then group number 4 that had written goals, action commitments, a friend's involvement, all of that resulted in 64% of the total population hitting their goals. And then the 5th and final group, where they had the written goals, the action commitments, the friend's involvement, as well as weekly progress report, had a success rate of 76% in achieving their goals. All of this basically says that the more accountable you are, the more likely you are to funnel all of your emotional energy into getting things done. And that you can use friends, family, peers to help turn that peer pressure into a positive force and reinforce your sense of accountability. Now, you can make progress with implementing any of these suggestions, but you're going to make the most progress and have an easier time directing your energy into a flow state when you layer them together. Remember, the point of achieving a flow state is to maximize the opportunities to accomplish something worthwhile. To do that, you're going to need to use your energy on a specific task over a long enough period of time to get what you want. And as you consistently put in the needed work over a long enough time horizon, you begin to acquire the resources needed to build the life you want. And that can be an education, a degree, a strong relationship with someone special. It can be more money, time, influence, anything in a community. It's whatever you care about, whatever accomplishment that you want to see in your life. But please be patient when you're applying this. It takes practice. It takes consistency. But I promise that as you make the effort to generate the needed energy and you focus it into a specific direction, and you protect it from any possible leakage or energy vampires, you will see so many cool improvements in your life. You'll learn how to motivate yourself through every circumstance, and you'll get a clearer and clearer picture of what your life's purpose is. And you will be amazed at how fast those wins can start to stack up and in turn into a truly special life. I promise you, if you can master this skill set and this process and apply it to your whole life, for an entire year, I guarantee you will be better than 99% of the people who are standing in the exact place where you are right now. So get after it, right? Start the clock by getting into a flow state and doing the work.